Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. Been a while since I've been on here. A couple of weeks. A lot going on in the news as of late. Uh, for one, Bad Bunny was announced for the Super Bowl in 20. Coming up, in 2026, and there's a lot of controversy around it. Us in the wrestling fan community, we already experienced a lot of the hatred against Bad Bunny, back in 2021 when he was going to appear in the WWE. Oh, nobody knows who he is. Nobody listens to his music. You know, can you even name one song from him? His music is in Spanish, okay? Right? But go back to my review of WrestleMania 37. What I said during that time, I said, give it a chance. The Latin American community is very vast. The Latin American community, there's a lot of Latinos, that like professional wrestling and they like his music and they're really attracted to it. The NFL, likewise, you know, we live in a globalized world. We don't just live here in the United States. You know what I mean? Where it's only English speaking people. We live in a world where there's English speaking people, Portuguese speaking people, French speaking people, Arabic speaking people, Russian speaking people. These are some of the biggest transnational languages in the world. And the Hispanic population is a very large demographic that the NFL wants to reach out to because the NFL in the international scope is in competition with other sports that have been successful, that are American original sports like baseball, that have been successful and branched out to the Latin American community. But football really hasn't. You know what I mean? So I guess NFL is trying to do that, by bringing in Bad Bunny. But interestingly enough, he was already he already performed, at other big events. So him getting the halftime show, I don't really see a problem with it. But Erica Kirk, Charlie Kirk's widow, she did see a problem with it. Her problem with it was, jingoism. She feels like let me explain this to you guys that may not know. Puerto Rico has been a United States territory, and Puerto Rican people have been U.S. citizens since 1917. There's something called the Jones Act that was passed in 1917, which was, more than 100 years ago now, that legalized Puerto Rico and made Puerto Rican people U.S. citizens. So Bad Bunny is an American. Bad Bunny is, while Puerto Rico is not one of the states, it's a territory. It was conquered by the United States in the Spanish-American War in 1898. There was a war between Spain and the United States, allegedly because Spain sunk an American ship called the Maine, and that was the impetus for America to enter into the war. Now, there was already pushes at that time for America to enter into that war because the Cubans and the Puerto Ricans and the Filipinos, for that matter, were the last three Spanish colonies that were fighting for their independence. You had uh, Ramon Antonio Betances was the leader that was fighting in Puerto Rico. You had Jose Marti fighting in Cuba, and Antonio Maceo fighting in Cuba, and you had Jose Rizal fighting in the Philippines. All the Spanish American. This is Hispanic Heritage Month, so I think I can go into this a little bit. All of the Spanish American colonies were independent by the 1890s. Most got their independence in the 1810s and the 1820s. So by the 1890s, it was only Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. So this was the age of neo-imperialism. France was expanding its empire in West Africa, West and North Africa. England was expanding its empire in South Asia, South and Southeast Asia, on the Indian subcontinent, as well as Malaysia and Myanmar/Burma. So the United States felt like, even though the United States had always been a country that pushed for the independence of colonies against European colonialism, because the United States was itself a product of British colonialism. um, um, they felt like they had to get in on the game. Theodore Roosevelt was a big imperialist, a big proponent of this, as was his predecessor, William McKinley, who was the president during the Spanish-American War. So a lot of American newspapers at this time were pushing for us to help the Cubans out, because they felt like the Cubans were our kindred spirits. They were like us. We were fighting against the British. They were fighting against the Spanish, and we should help them out, right? But other Americans had all their ulterior motives, wanting to colonize parts of Latin America. So what ends up happening at the end of the war, it only lasts a couple of months, as Theodore Roosevelt himself said, who led the Rough Riders, a military force, during that war. He said it was a splendid little war. It only lasted a couple of months, and Spain drops out, and we take control of parts of Cuba, Guantanamo Bay, which we still own. Right, we occupy Cuba until 1901, and we also take control of the Philippines and Puerto Rico. Now, and it wasn't without a fight either. One of the conflicts/wars that they don't really talk about in American history is the American-Filipino War. As you know, there is a population in the southern part of the Philippines called it's Mindanao, called the Moro population. They were the Muslim. They're the Muslim Filipinos. And when we were coming in there, taking over for the Spanish, as being the new colonial power, they gave us somewhat of an issue, as you would imagine that Muslims would do, given what we know about Islam and its history of martial resistance to occupation and things of that nature. So, we occupied the Philippines until the 1940s, and then we gave the Philippines their independence. But when it comes to Puerto Rico, this is why most Filipinos know English and they do not know Spanish, because we did a tremendous job in wiping the Spanish colonial legacy away from the Philippines. Pretty much the only thing they've retained that's Spanish is a Creole language called Chubacano, in the southern part of the Philippines, and their last names and the Catholic religion. Other than that, they pretty much were thoroughly Americanized during the period in which we colonized them. But when it came to Puerto Rico, once again, Puerto Rico didn't have that luxury. Now, there have been several times, in Puerto Rican history where, just like it was when they were under the Spanish, under the rule of Spain, where there were people in Puerto Rican history that wanted their independence. There are still some that would like, it to be an independent country, free from U.S. rule. But the vast majority like the way that it is. So what many people don't know is this act, the Jones Act, was passed right as we were about to enter into World War I. Much like the Spanish-American War, World War I was not a conflict that we wanted to get into. We viewed it as a European conflict, which it was. It was between Europe's great powers, between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and their allies, and the Ottoman Empire, which was the sick man of Europe, barely hanging on. The Russian Empire was involved, the British Empire, and the German empire ruled by the Kaiser at this time. And Gabriel Precept, a, 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 a Serbian nationalist, was angry with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he shot Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914. That set off a chain reaction of various factions in Europe and eventually led to World War One. Now, we're all the way across on the Atlantic. Our president at the time, President Woodrow Wilson, he pledged that he was not going to get involved. But then in 1917 comes the sinking of the Lusitania, allegedly by Germans. So much like the Spanish-American War, we were kind of provoked into it, and then we got into it, and we needed more troops. So we figured, hey, we got this colonial territory in the Caribbean, Puerto Rico. All we got to do is make them U.S. citizens, and they'll be eligible to serve, and you'll have extra manpower. And that's what we did. So, yes, Bad Bunny is a U.S. citizen. Puerto Ricans, even those born in Puerto Rico, are U.S. citizens. Been that way since 1917, and that's not going to change. Now, of course, he speaks Spanish. You know what I mean? Like, it's a former Spanish colony. Today is Columbus Day. Today, was the beginning of the colonialist project in the Americas. 1492, Columbus, sails the ocean blue, as it were, the saying. And on behalf of the Europeans, on behalf of the King and Queen of Spain, he colonized the Americas, and Puerto Rico was one of the places he colonized. He originally named it San Juan de Baptiste, after St. John the Baptist, right? And then have Ponce de Leon coming in, at a later period in the 1500s, coming in and becoming the first governor of Puerto Rico, renaming it from what it was, Boninquen, which is the original name given to it by the Taínos, the original natives of the island. He renames it to a Spanish name, and it's been that way ever since. And they maintain their heritage language, in a way. Spanish, the Spanish language, and the Catholic religion, and the flag have been elements of colonial resistance, them resisting against the hegemony of the United States. Now, of mainstream U.S. culture. But Erica Kirk doesn't think so. She's going to organize an opposition halftime show with Kid Rock and Jelly Roll and all that. But good luck to her. Fuck that, bro. You know what I mean? Like, you're just doing that because you're racist, against Latinos. This whole administration has been using ICE, weaponizing ICE to demonize Latinos, to demonize Hispanics. You know what I mean? Not just illegal immigrants, not just immigrants, Hispanics. You know what I mean? Because, you're attacking Bad Bunny, an American citizen, a Puerto Rican. Why? What makes him any different than Rihanna, who's from Barbados, Maroon 5 guy who's from Canada, right? But Rihanna's black. Maroon 5 guy is white. You know what I mean? So you're not targeting them, but you're targeting Bad Bunny. And Bad Bunny's not an illegal. He's not a Mexican, right? He's an American citizen of a Hispanic descent. But keep in mind, this whole project of America wouldn't even exist if it were not for the King and Queen of Spain commissioning Christopher Columbus to sail across and find a safer route to Asia. Because as we discussed before in another video about Columbus Day, um, what led to him having to do that? There were several factors. One was the Crusades. The Crusades, obviously, in 1096, the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II declares war against the Seljuk Turks, the Muslim army that was occupying uh, the Holy Land at that time, Palestine. We'll get to discussing that. But he commissions an army, and in 1099 they take the city and they and they convert it to the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, ruled by the Catholic Church, mostly Norman Frenchmen. It was Godfrey of Bouillon who was the conquering soldier, taking it from the Seljuk Turks and whatever remnant was of both the Abbasid Empire and the Abbasid Empire out of Baghdad and the Fatimid Empire out of Cairo. And there was animosity that existed, and for almost 100 years until 1187, Saladin gets it back and drives the Christian Crusaders, out of the land. And in the 1620s, in the 1260s, the Mamluk, another Turkish dynasty, finally drives all of the Christian Crusaders out of the land, and there's animosity between them. And then in 1453, something else happens that's a calamitous thing in the Christian world. Constantinople, which was the new Rome, which was from in the 400s. Emperor Constantine, after he converts to Christianity, he moves the capital of from Western Rome in Italy to Eastern Rome in Anatolia and Turkey, and that becomes the administrative capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, as we call it in the West. But the Ottoman Turks take that over in 1453, and that was a major trade conduit from east to west, moving products like silk, things that came from China and India to the West, right? That was a major trade route, and it was acceptable for Western Christians, because even though there was a schism between the Latin Catholic Church and the Byzantine Greek Church, they were still Christians, But once they're no longer Christians, once they're under the control of the Ottoman Turks, the Muslims, then that trade route is blocked. Columbus can't go there. And that's really the only way that Europeans know how to get to Asia. So they have to find a faster route to Asia. So after the Reconquista, after the Christians take over, Spain had been under Muslim control for 800 years. But the Catholics, they fought back and they reconquered the Iberian Peninsula, and the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon unite under Ferdinand and Isabella. And then, no sooner than that, a month later or so, they commissioned Christopher Columbus, a Genoese sailor, to find this faster route to Asia in order so they could spread Christianity to what they perceived to be either Muslim or heathen lands, mostly China and India. He doesn't land in China or India. He's an avid reader of Marco Polo. Marco Polo, another Italian explorer, actually did go to these lands, because at this time China was under the Yuan dynasty controlled by the Mongols, and the Mongol rule was so expansive that it linked the Middle East with East Asia and with parts of India. So he goes there and he writes about it, and they read about it in Europe, and they want to go there too. But he doesn't find anything. Columbus doesn't find anything close to what was written about in terms of the wealth of India or China. What he finds is a whole new world. Taino Indians, people that he refers to as Indians, indigenous people here in the United States. And they do have some gold. They don't have much, but they have some. And he takes it and controls it, and he enslaves them, and he kills them, and and due to disease and genocide, pretty much wipes them out, necessitating the need for African slavery later on. It gets so bad that one of the friars, Bartolomé de las Casas, writes in a book, about how horrific the Spanish conquest of the Americas was. And this also gets circulated around in Europe, and people are just shocked. And eventually, the Catholic Church has to step in, and the Pope at that time is like, "Listen, we're not going to enslave any more Native Americans." They forbid to enslave Native Americans, so because Native Americans have been completely decimated, so that necessitated the import of African slaves. They'd already been enslaving Africans in places in the Mediterranean, the sugar colonies in the Mediterranean, like Cyprus, and in Spain as well, because while Spain was under the Muslims, it's true, Muslims also engaged in the enslavement of Africans, some who were Muslim and some who were not. One of the reasons that a lot of Westerners believe or think that the Moors were entirely black. The Moors were what they called the Muslim ruling elite in Spain, was because the Berbers, the native North Africans, and the Arabs as well, used black African military slaves. So a lot of their military was African slaves composed a lot of their infantry. So on the battlefield, the Christian Spaniards, during the Reconquista, what they saw was these black Africans who were slaves of the ruling elite, in Spain. So the Spaniards had been used to black Africans, being enslaved in the Iberian Peninsula. It was nothing new to them. As a matter of fact, Christopher Columbus himself had Pedro Alonso Nino, who was a Landino. A Landino was an African who was Hispanicized. He spoke the Spanish language. He practiced the Catholic religion. He was culturally a Spaniard, and he sailed on the boat with Christopher Columbus and arrived here. Estebanico is another one who sailed with the conquistador Cabeza de Vaca, and he helped him conquer the southwestern United States. For the crown of Spain. So, that's how that happened. But then kind of unleashed Pandora's box, because once they found out, we don't have to depend on this ever diminishing population of Native Americans, in the West Indies. We could, we have this vast amount of human capital in West Africa. We could just import them. That's what they did. And slavery in the West Indies, Puerto Rico included, because it's part of the West Indies, was 10 times more brutal than slavery in the United States. In Brazil too, in Colombia, all these places in Latin America, 10 times more brutal. And they felt like they could do it because the Portuguese controlled the slave trade. The Portuguese had kingdoms in Benin. The Portuguese had kingdoms in Cameroon. The Portuguese had these outposts in the Congo, converting King Alfonso to, to Christianity and stuff. I mean, they had connections in these African kingdoms, so they had a dearth of human capital that they could exploit. Then they did exploit. And they built whole slavetocracies, in the West Indies. First, it was just the Spanish, and then the Portuguese got into it. When they accidentally were going to India, and they accidentally landed in Brazil. And there was this whole conflict between Spain and Portugal because, Christopher Columbus sailed for Spain. He claimed the entire New World for Spain. You know what I mean? But now the Portuguese have stumbled upon this other place. So the Pope had to intervene, and he said, look, Spain can have all these other colonies, but Portugal gets this place, Brazil. And that was the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. 2 years after Columbus's maiden voyage. And that's why Brazil's the only country in the Americas that speaks Portuguese. But then other countries wanted to get involved. France, they sent out expeditions with Cartier and Champlain, and eventually they landed in the St. Lawrence River in North America. The first to really land in North America besides Ponce de Leon with the St. Augustine settlement in Florida. But like North America, like Canada, Quebec, the French, laid claim to that. Then the Dutch want to get involved. They come to New York in the 17th century, and they colonized New York. And finally, the British, or at that time the English, after 1588, the King of Spain tries to invade England, right? With the Spanish Armada to invade England under the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. She pushes them back, but then she says, hey, why should Catholic Spain have all this wealth and making them the wealthiest nation in all of Europe? We want some of this. So she sends out, Sir Francis Drake, and he goes to warn the Caribbean for the sake of England. At first, the English were just pirates, right? And they set up the Roanoke colony. It goes missing. All the people in the Roanoke colony die, and then finally, so Walter Raleigh's another one that she sends out. Finally, in 1607, under the reign of King James, he does in Virginia the exact same thing that he did in Ireland, where in Ireland he wanted to Protestantize Ireland, so he takes a bunch of Scots and plants them in Northern Ireland. They become the Protestant outpost because he himself is Scottish, because he had to assume the throne because Queen Elizabeth I had no heirs. She was the Virgin Queen. He decides he wants to do the same thing in America. And in 1607, he founds the state of Virginia, Jamestown, Virginia, the first permanent English settlement in the Americas. But the Spaniards already had them by like hundreds of years, right? In Santo Domingo, which was the first Spanish settlement in the Americas. And then, then the other colonies, Georgia, the Carolinas, etc. And it won't be long until Spain's empire, slowly ticks away until we get to 1898, when, like I said, that was the last of Spanish-American War, and Spain really fell behind civilization-wise. And the United States, when it declares its independence in 1776, decides that they don't want any more involved in the colonies out of the Americas. President James Monroe makes the decree, the Monroe Doctrine, that if any peoples of the Americas are fighting for their independence against a European power, the United States will basically defend them, right? But this somehow this doesn't apply to England or France. This only applies to Spain because America has treaties with England. They have treaties with France. They don't have a treaty with Spain, and they kind of don't respect Spain because Spain is Catholic. Spain is the Catholic nation. Um, in the 16th century, uh, religion was very important in each country. Each religion, and each religious sect had their representative, on the world stage. You had Spain representing the Catholics, England representing the Protestants. Shah Ismail had come to power in Iran, so he's representing the Shias, right? And then you have Suleiman the Magnificent and the Ottoman Turks representing the Sunnis. And then off in the east, Russia is coming into her own, representing Eastern Orthodoxy, kind of taking the mantle for the Byzantine Empire after its fall. So after America inheriting that Anglo-Saxon heritage, that heritage of Protestantism, feels like we have to strike out against Spain, which is the Catholic nation. So there was always that animosity from the time in 1588 when Spain tries to invade England to the time of 1898 when America and Spain go to war. There was always that kind of animosity. And I think even after several Hispanic territories become part of the United States, for example, after the Mexican-American War in 1840s, with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, you have a bunch of formerly Spanish territories inhabited by descendants of Spaniards, Europeans, mestizos, Mexicans, half European, half native, mixed race people that are Mexicans, both in California, New Mexico, Texas, all these places that were formerly part of the Spanish Empire, then part of Mexico, now becoming part of the United States. There was that anti-Hispanic heritage, anti-Hispanic sentiment even then among Anglo-Protestants in the United States. We talked about Mendez versus Westminster and Hernandez versus the state of Texas. These laws that decriminalize segregation against Hispanics. So it was just the same way, when they went into the Caribbean after the Spanish-American War. There's always been that kind of anti-Hispanic hatred in the United States. I wouldn't say that it is as strong as the anti-Black hatred in the United States. Maybe it's a little bit stronger now because Donald Trump and the administration have really zeroed in on Hispanic immigrants because Hispanic immigrants are the main ones, because of geography. You have the United States, you have Canada, you have the West Indies, the English West Indies, the Dutch West Indies, the French West Indies. But other than that, and in Brazil, and I include in the Dutch West Indies, Suriname, and in the British West Indies, Guyana. But other than that, every other country is Latino. Like, so it's kind of like they're surrounded, right? So in other Latino news, in the Nobel Peace Prize situation, Donald Trump has been lobbying for the Nobel Peace Prize forever, since I would say about 2018, when he and Kim Jong-un sat down and we're going to bring an end to the Korean War, a conflict that has existed since the 1950s. in Asia. There are two separate countries. One is a communist country in the north, and the other is a democratic country in the south. And Donald Trump was going to bring these two together and finally bring an end to this conflict on the Korean Peninsula. It didn't end up happening. Kim Jong Un, it went to a stalemate. It was historic at the time he did it, and he's been lobbying for the Nobel Peace Prize ever since. Now, part of the reason why he lobbied for this was because Barack Obama received one in 2009. Now, back when Barack Obama received it, I was a supporter of Barack Obama. I donated to his campaign. I was usually a supporter of him when he was president. But the truth of the matter is, what did Barack Obama do that warranted a Nobel Peace Prize in 2009? You know what I mean? Like he had just gotten in office. Now, many people would say the speech in front of Al Azhar University in Egypt, reaching out an olive branch after the whole war on terror thing. The war on terror was not a war on terror. The war on terror, as launched by President Bush and his administration, was a war on Islam. You know what I mean? Because there were many other Marxist terrorist organizations in Latin America. There were many other right-wing terrorist organizations in Latin America and other parts of the world. Ethnic terrorists, like in Sri Lanka, for example, the Tamil Tigers, that were trying to topple the Sri Lankan government, which is majority Ceylonese, ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka. For example, that he didn't go after, he, being President Bush, did not go after. He mainly went after Al Qaeda and other Islamist terrorist organizations, which is understandable because, as we are made to believe, the mainstream story about 9/11 was that Islamist 19 hijackers, attacked us on September the 11th, 2001. But there have been a lot of animosity between the United States and the Muslim world because of this and the invasion of Iraq in 2003. So Barack Obama went to Al Azhar University, one of the most prestigious universities in Egypt and in the Islamic world, and he extended an olive branch to the Muslim world, to the biggest luminaries in the Muslim world. And maybe that was why he received a Nobel Peace Prize in 2009. I don't know. I don't know why, right? But he did. And Donald Trump has been jealous of him forever. The sole reason why Donald Trump ran for president was because the White House Correspondents' Dinner, Barack Obama insulted him. And he felt belittled, so he just started to come out, and he said, you know what I'll do? Come, 2015, when the candidacy for the next run of president, I will announce my candidacy. And that's what he did. And he's wanted to be bigger and better than Barack Obama's presidency. And one of the things that has eluded him is the Nobel Peace Prize. And he thought by negotiating the peace between Israel and Hamas, getting the hostages home after 2 years solid, October 7th, 2023, at the Nova Music Festival. The Nova Music Festival was attacked, and Hamas took these hostages. And Donald Trump thought that this would be the thing this would be the catalyst for a Nobel Peace Prize. Unfortunately, that was not to be the case. He did not receive it. A Venezuelan woman, I believe her name is Karina Machado. Maria Corina Machado received the Nobel Peace Prize this year, and according to Donald Trump, he said that she wanted him to receive it. She has been working tirelessly against the dictatorship, Nicolas Maduro's dictatorship in Venezuela, trying to overthrow the Maduro regime, which we know is a horrible regime. And Trump has been working towards that as well. He was doing it in his last administration. We were straight up backing Juan Guaida. I don't know what happened to him. You know what I mean? As Maduro's next replacement, but it just didn't materialize. And she's been working tirelessly for the peace in Venezuela. Controlling. So she's more deserving of it. There were a lot of factors here at play with Israel and Hamas. It wasn't just Trump. The Qataris played a role. They've been kind of the Qataris have been the intermediaries between the United States and Hamas and Israel. So they kind of more so played a role in this. But some people are even saying that this deal is not a good deal. That this deal is on the loser end of things when it comes to Israel, what they get, as far as Hamas still controls Gaza. Hamas is still the ruling power of Gaza. So this peace won't last. You know what I mean? Hamas is an organization, their sole purpose is the destruction of the state of Israel. Like, they will not compromise with Israel on long terms. We know there's a history in Islamic warfare of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, which is a treaty that Prophet Muhammad made with the pagans and their Jewish backers, in Arabia during the time when he was fighting for the supremacy of Islam. And he eventually broke this treaty. So you're allowed to make, Islamically, you're allowed to make treaties and then break them. So this is probably what's going to happen. The PLO did it for years against Israel, and this is probably what's going to happen. The peace is not long lasting. So the Nobel Peace Prize people probably known this, that the peace wasn't long lasting. So they're like, you know what? Why are we going to give it to Trump for the Israel Hamas thing? We give it to this girl who is. There's a greater likelihood that there will be peace in Venezuela than there will be peace in the Middle East. Okay, what other news? In wrestling news, the Vision has a new vision. The Vision now is no longer Seth Rollins' group. Seth Rollins has been kicked out of the Vision. Raw was about to go off the air in Australia when Braun Breaker speared Seth Rollins. And this comes on the heels of Dave Meltzer's fake reporting that Seth Rollins will be one of the 5 in War Games. So he's not going to be on Team War Games. Brock Lesnar might be on Paul Heyman's team on War Games, but Seth Rollins definitely won't. So I don't know where this leaves Jacob Fatu, where this leaves Roman Reigns and the Usos. Roman Reigns was laid out at Crown Jewel Perth. And just going through some of my thoughts on Crown Jewel Perth. Now, this was one of the first time ever that the Crown Jewel was held outside of Saudi Arabia, in another country, in Australia. And I got to say, the matches that really stood out, the one that everybody's talking about, John Cena versus AJ Styles, a tremendous match. They always had tremendous chemistry. And John Cena and AJ Styles, AJ Styles is coming close to the end of his career. John Cena's coming close to the end of his career. It brings us back to 2017. when they had their classic feuds, and it was just a great match. Better than, and Stephanie Vaquer versus Tiffany Stratton was also a great match. Better than uh, Seth Rollins versus Cody Rhodes for the Crown Jewel title. Once again, Cody Rhodes, now they got the belt on him again. It's a dry reign. Nothing happening. As far as Cody Rhodes as the champion, so they put the Crown Jewel belt on him. They put the Crown Jewel belt on Stephanie Vaquer. A bunch of memes with Stephanie Vaquer's ass. People are in love with her ass. Her ass looks good, man. Why not? Right? The Devil's Kiss is probably one of the best finishers in WWE right now. So that's that. The Vision has a new vision now. I think Brock Lesnar will get more involved with the storylines, going forward as we go into War Games and Survivor Series. So we just got to see, man. And AJ Lee is also booked for War Games, the Women's War Games. So she wasn't at Crown Jewel, but she will be at War Games. There is some talk as far as John Cena's last match of Tony Khan lending Adam Copeland, Edge, to the WWE to wrestle John Cena. I think that's just wishful thinking, guys. I don't think that's going to happen. You know what I mean? I don't see that kind of interpromotional battle going on between AEW and WWE, honestly. But as far as an interpromotional battle between TNA and WWE, which they've been in a partnership this whole year now, that really took off well in the match between the Dudley Boys and Hardys. They had their Invasion pay-per-view, their NXT Invasion, which the government of Israel raised a big stink about because it was on October 7th, and to call it an invasion is kind of insensitive. But they changed it, and it was a great match between the Dudleys and the Hardys, man. Those memories, if you lived as a wrestling fan in the early 2000s, WrestleMania 2000, WrestleMania 16, that was the best match on the show, guys. It was the Hardys, Edge and Christian, and the Dudleys. They had a great rivalry. It was great to see those guys, finally get the respect they deserve, man. But and also, more wrestling news. AI has taken over the wrestling world now. Now we're starting to see deceased celebrities. Michael Jackson, Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, Martin Luther King Jr., and Tupac involved in fantasy scenarios in the WWE. You have Tupac joining the NWO, which I ain't gonna lie, I felt it was disrespectful with MLK. Like MLK has this one video, right, where he's doing this savage line. He says, "I ain't got no dream no more. I am the dream." And like Tupac joining the NWO. But as far as Tupac joining the NWO, man, as big an NWO fan as I was when I was a kid, 1996, 7, 8, and as big a Tupac fan as I was as a kid, 1996, 7, 8, those years, and 94, 95, Tupac was the first rapper that I got into when I was like 11, 12, when I started listening to rap. You know what I mean? So if he were to join the NWO, man, in real life, that would have been like, I would have been on cloud 9. Like, how I would have want to jump to my TV screen if I would have saw that for real. So seeing it in an AI version is kind of weird and surreal. But that Tupac book, Only God Could Judge Me, is coming out in, October 20th, either 20th or 21st. I have that pre-ordered already, so definitely going to read that. You know what I mean? But yeah, I feel like these AI videos are kind of disrespectful in a way. Like I said, when they first came out, I was hyped to see them. because they look so realistic. But Tupac is one thing. You know what I'm saying? He's a historical figure. He means a lot politically, especially with his aunt passing away, what she meant as far as like, the Black Power movement and things of that nature. So it's kind of mocking him in a way. I get it. But other figures like MLK and stuff, this kind of stuff is even worse because like Tupac was semi-political, but he was also a pop culture figure. He was a rapper. You know what I mean? He wasn't. MLK is something different. Like that means something to a lot of people because of what he represents as far as like the civil rights movement, as far as a cultural icon, and not just the black community, but all communities because he inspired, the Chicano resistance movement with Cesar Chavez. He inspired the Young Lords. He inspired it all snowballs from MLK. MLK takes the mantle in 1955, takes up the case of Rosa Parks in Montgomery, Alabama. And you have this snowball of resistance of racial and minorities and marginalized groups. Third wave feminism comes out of that. The gay rights movement comes out of that. All that comes out of that. Out of what MLK represents for the resistance movement and the counterculture in the late 50s, throughout the 60s, into the early 70s. So he means a lot more than somebody like Tupac, who was a political figure, a social figure, but at the same time was an entertainer. And had he lived for when professional wrestling became popular, because when Tupac was really doing his thing in after he got out of jail, right? When he dropped All Eyes on Me, right? Okay, let's say his year was like 91 when Tupacalypse Now comes out. 91, 92, Strictly for My Niggas in 92. Up until All Eyes on Me, when he was really doing his thing in the music business, wrestling was not something that a rapper would want to get involved with because it wasn't pop culture, it wasn't mainstream. Wrestling had kind of fallen off in 1989 and wasn't really rejuvenated until July of 96, and he was alive back then. But when it really got popular in 97, 98, Tupac was already passed away. He passed away in September of 96. So he never really got that chance. You know what I mean? Would he have done it? Maybe he would have. It's something he would have been interested in. I don't know. One never knows, does one? But MLK definitely not. Would have never entertained such things. Partially because he was for nonviolence. I mean, that was his mantra, nonviolence. Why would he get involved in a sport that was a sport or a form of entertainment that is predicated on violence? And secondly, he was a Christian minister and a political activist. He wasn't a professional wrestler and entertainer. So, portraying him in that way is disrespectful. And then portraying him as turning heel, something that he would never have done. He was already a heel in a lot of people's minds to begin with in real life. Segregationist and all that stuff. Like, it's just funny. It's just disrespectful, highly disrespectful. As far as Michael Jackson, he liked professional wrestling. He was a wrestling fan. His family was wrestling fans. He was a UFC fan also. He would go to UFC shows in disguises, to watch them. Joseph and Catherine Jackson, would attend wrestling shows in the territory days in the Olympic Auditorium in Southern California. So that would not be so far-fetched. Fred Rogers, I don't know. Mr. Rogers, if he would ever want to be involved with something like that. Probably not. You know what I mean? So some of these AI videos and some of the non-wrestling AI videos that are portraying like like Dr. Martin Luther King saying some gang shit. You know what I mean? Like he was a Chicago gang member, which he was not a Chicago gang member. Put it that way. He was not a Chicago gang member. But when he came to Chicago, because he was starting to branch out from the South into other parts, he came to Chicago. He knew that in the black community, the gangs, particularly the Black P. Stones and the Gangster Disciples, they held some sway, and he used them, to organize. So he was not a gang member, but he did have, connections with groups like the Gangster Disciples and the Black P. Stone Nation, Jeff Ford. So saying disrespectful gangster shit is disrespectful, putting those words in his mouth, but at the same time, it wasn't like he was totally against, using people that were part of street gangs either in his organizations, especially towards the later years, like in the 60s when he was trying to broaden his audience because a lot of the black community had started to perceive him as soft, especially when they were confronted with harder alternatives like Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael and the Black Panthers. They kind of saw him on the softer end. MLK by the time the 60s came, so he needed that plug into black youth culture. So he wasn't above using them, but some of the other shit that they have him saying is just downright disrespectful. I'm talking about the non-wrestling means, But that's all, guys. Those are basically all the topics that I wanted to discuss and talk about that are going on in the world today. Later on, I'll be doing a video on Diane Keaton's passing. I didn't forget about Diane Keaton. I'm going to definitely talk about her, in a long form video, but I just wanted to get these little topics, fleshed away. And we're on to Survivor Series War Games. Peace, guys. Love you.